Welcome to Bedtime Biographies. If you're settling in for the night, finding a comfortable position, letting the noise of the day begin to fade, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we'll spend time with the life of Mineko Iwasaki. She was a geisha, one of the most celebrated geisha of 20th century Japan. By the time she retired, she was widely regarded as the finest practitioner of her art in the ancient city of Kyoto. But here is something worth holding gently in mind as we begin. Mineko Iwasaki did not leave the world of the geisha because she had failed at it. She left because she had succeeded, completely, and almost impossibly so. And she left entirely by choice, at the age of 29. When most careers are barely getting started. She was not pushed out. She walked away. And what she walked away from was something most people on Earth will never fully understand. A world of ritual and discipline and extraordinary beauty. A world that has existed in Japan for centuries. A world that very few outsiders have ever truly seen from the inside. Years later, her life would become entangled with the story the world knew as Memoirs of a Geisha. But Mineko's own story was quieter, stranger, and far more human. I find her story quietly compelling for that reason. So much of her life was lived in a kind of purposeful privacy. She had enormous public presence, and yet she remained deeply interior, reserved in the way that people are when they have given most of themselves to something other than being known. She was simply trying to be excellent, and for a long time, she was. So, gently and without hurry, let's begin. Mineko Iwasaki was born on the 2nd of November in 1949 in the city of Kyoto, Japan. Kyoto is one of the oldest cities in Japan. For more than 1,000 years, it served as the imperial capital. It was the center of the country's culture, its refinement, its artistic traditions. Even now, Kyoto holds a different feeling from other Japanese cities. It is quieter in some ways, more layered. The streets in its older districts still carry the shape of a much older world. And it was in one of those older districts, the hanamachi of Gion Kobu, that Mineko's story would eventually unfold. But first, her earliest years. She was born into a large family with many siblings. Her family was not wealthy. Life was modest and full in the way that life tends to be when a household holds many children and limited means. Her father, Shigezo Tanaka, was a gentle man by her later accounts, someone who valued beauty and art, even when the circumstances of daily life did not make much room for either. Her mother, Chie Tanaka, born Chie Akamatsu, managed the household. She was practical and strong in the way that mothers of large families often have to be. Mineko was one of the younger children. She grew up surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a busy family home. Kyoto itself, in those years, was still slowly recovering from the weight of the Second World War. Japan as a whole was rebuilding. Cities were changing. The economy was cautiously finding its footing again. But Kyoto had been spared the worst of the wartime destruction. Its ancient temples, its wooden neighborhoods, its old geisha districts, the hanamachi, had survived largely intact. And so the world that Mineko would one day enter was still there, quietly waiting. The path that led Mineko to the Okiya, the geisha house, began when she was very young. She was around 3 years old when she first visited one. The Okiya she would come to call home was run by a woman named Madame Oima, who led the Iwasaki house in Gion Kobu. The Iwasaki name was one of the most respected in the hanamachi. It carried history and reputation. Mineko's connection to this world came through her older sister, who had already entered the Okiya before her. When Mineko visited as a small child, something happened that those close to her would speak of for years. She saw the Maiko, the apprentice Geisha, dancing, and she was captivated, not in the passing way that young children are sometimes caught by something bright or novel. This was something quieter and more settled, something that held. She told Madame Oima, with the directness that very small children sometimes have, that she wanted to dance like that. Madame Oima was not the kind of woman who dismissed such things easily. She watched Mineko. She observed her, and she recognized something worth taking seriously. The process began gradually. A visit here, a lesson there, a slow and careful drawing into a world that operated entirely by its own ancient rules. In time, Mineko was formally adopted into the Iwasaki Okiya. This was a real and significant arrangement. Her birth parents agreed to it. They understood what it meant, that their daughter would be raised and trained within the Geisha tradition, that she would carry the Iwasaki name professionally, and that her life would be shaped accordingly. It was not a small decision on anyone's part, but for Mineko herself, even as a very young child, there does not seem to have been much ambivalence. She wanted this world. She had seen a glimpse of it, and something in her had already decided. The world she was entering had its own vocabulary, its own hierarchy, its own deeply particular way of doing everything. It is worth pausing here for a moment, not too long, to say something about what the hanamachi actually was, and what it meant to grow up inside it. The hanamachi, or flower town, is the district where geisha live and work. Gion Kobu, where Mineko lived, is the most prestigious of Kyoto's hanamachi. It has existed in some form for several centuries. It has its own customs, its own governing body, its own calendar of events and performances. Geisha are not what Western popular culture has so often imagined them to be. They are artists. They are performers. They are practitioners of traditional Japanese music, dance, and the refined art of hospitality and conversation. The training is long. It begins in childhood and continues for many years. A young woman first becomes a Maiko, an apprentice, and only after years of dedicated study does she become a full geisha. In the Kyoto dialect, a full geisha is called a Geiko. The arts that Geiko study are specific and demanding. Classical Japanese dance, the shamisen, which is a three-stringed instrument with a sound unlike anything from the Western musical tradition. Tea ceremony, the proper way to move through a room, the proper way to speak, even the proper way to wear a kimono, which is itself a considerable art form. Everything in this world has a name. Everything has a correct way of being done. And there are people whose entire lives are devoted to teaching those correct ways. For Mineko, this structure was not a weight. It was something closer to a home. She took to the training with a focus that was unusual, even by the standards of dedicated students. She was precise. She was patient when precision required patience. And she understood, even as a child, the difference between doing something adequately and doing it well. The early years were immersive. Mineko lived in the Okiya. She learned the rhythms of its daily life. She watched the older women who lived and worked there. She absorbed the culture not only through formal instruction, but through quiet observation over long stretches of ordinary time. Madame Oima was a significant presence in her early life. Oima was exacting. She had high standards and did not offer praise easily. But she saw in Mineko something worth cultivating with great care. Their relationship was layered, as such relationships often are. There was clear authority on one side and obedience expected on the other. But there was also, in its own restrained way, a depth of investment. Oima was not just training a student. She was shaping someone she believed could carry the Iwasaki name forward with real distinction. Mineko began her formal dance training when she was still very young. She studied under masters of the Inoue School of Classical Dance, which is the style associated with Gion Kobu. The Inoue School is considered one of the most refined and demanding of all Japanese classical dance traditions. Its movements are subtle. They are not large or theatrical. The art lives in the smallest gestures, the angle of a wrist, the quality of a gaze, the way the body moves through space with absolute and unhurried control. Mineko practiced for hours, not only because the Okiya required it, though it did, but because the practice itself held her attention completely. There is a word in Japanese, shokunin, that describes a person who gives themselves entirely to the mastery of a single craft. It carries ideas of patience, of repetition, of the long, unglamorous work that true mastery always requires. Mineko was, in many ways, a shokunin in the making. As she moved through those early years of training, the world outside the Okiya was changing quickly. Japan in the 1950s and into the 60s was transforming at a pace that felt, to many people, almost disorienting. The post-war economy recovered, then grew, then surged. Cities expanded. Western influence arrived in waves. A new and thoroughly modern kind of Japanese life was taking shape. And yet, inside the hanamachi, the pace of change was much slower. The traditions were old. The structures were old. The expectations, in both their most sustaining and their most difficult forms, were old. Girls who trained in the Okiya gave up much of what children in other circumstances might have taken for granted. Their time was not their own. Their movements through the city were limited. Their choices were shaped by the house, by their teachers, by the long weight of custom. But in return, they were given something genuinely rare: access to arts that almost no one else could practice at that level. Entry into a world with its own deep beauty. A life that, despite its constraints, had a very clear sense of purpose running through it. For Mineko, that purposefulness was real and sustaining. She could see what she was working toward. She understood the shape of the life ahead. And that clarity gave the long days of practice their meaning. She was still a child, but she was already learning to inhabit a very particular kind of discipline. The kimono alone required years of understanding. It is not a garment in the simple sense. It is a system. The layers, the obi sash wound tightly around the waist, the specific way the collar sits at the back of the neck, all of it communicates something. All of it means something to those who know how to read it. A Maiko's kimono is different from a Geiko's kimono. The sleeves are longer. The obi is tied in a particular trailing style at the back. The collar is often red and heavily embroidered. The whole effect is elaborate and deliberate. Learning to move inside all of that, naturally, without visible effort, without stiffness, takes a very long time. Mineko practiced this too. The walk, the posture, The way of sitting and rising from the floor without disturbing a single fold. It was slow work. All of it was slow work. But slowness, in this world, was not a problem to be solved. It was the point. There was also music. The shamisen is the instrument most closely associated with Geisha culture. It has a long, thin neck and a small body covered in skin. When played, it produces a sound that is dry and percussive and deeply distinctive. There is nothing quite like it. Mineko studied the shamisen alongside her dance training. She also studied the fue, a type of traditional flute, and she learned the ozashiki, the art of the banquet room itself, how to enter, how to converse, how to make guests feel at ease without effort or performance. This last skill is perhaps the hardest to teach. The ozashiki is not a stage in the ordinary sense. It is a private room, usually quite small, where guests are entertained by Maiko and Geiko over an evening of food, drink, music, and conversation. The atmosphere in such a room depends entirely on the skill of the women present, on their ability to read the mood, to speak when speaking, add something, to be quiet when quiet is better, to fill a room with a kind of warmth that does not call attention to itself. This was an art Mineko would develop slowly, over years. It was not something that came from lessons alone. It came from experience, from hundreds of evenings in those small rooms, observing and gradually participating, until the whole thing became as natural as breathing. When Mineko was around 6 years old, she began attending a school specifically for Maiko and Geiko in Gion Kobu. The school was called the Nyokoba. It had been established generations earlier to preserve and teach the traditional arts of the hanamachi. At the Nyokoba, Mineko studied dance formally. She also received instruction in tea ceremony, in the various musical arts, and in the other disciplines that shaped the Geiko's practice. The school was attended by girls at different stages of their training. Some were new. Some had been studying for years. The older students were models for the younger ones. The progression was visible and real. Mineko watched the advanced students carefully. She filed away what she noticed. The quality of a particular girl's movements, the ease with which another carried herself, the subtle differences that separated competent from extraordinary. She was building, even then, a very precise inner sense of what excellence looked like. The years passed steadily inside the Okiya. Life there followed a rhythm that changed very little from season to season. Mornings began early. Practice came first. Lessons filled the middle hours. And as she grew older, the evenings would gradually begin to include real professional engagements. But that was still some years away. For now, there was the daily accumulation of small skills, the patient layering of one thing upon another, the kind of learning that does not feel dramatic while it is happening, but that quietly becomes something significant over time. Mineko was not unhappy. This is worth saying clearly, because it would be easy to imagine that a child transplanted into such a strict and structured world must have suffered, and some children in similar circumstances did find it hard. But Mineko, by her own account, was genuinely absorbed in what she was doing. She had chosen this, in whatever way a very young child can choose anything, and the choosing had been real enough that it carried her through the difficulty without breaking her sense of purpose. She was homesick sometimes, in the particular way that children who live away from their birth families can be homesick. Not devastatingly so, But quietly, she missed ordinary things. The particular sounds of her family home, the casual company of siblings. But the Okiya had its own warmth too. There were other girls training alongside her. There were women in the house who watched over her. The structure itself, however strict, was also a form of containment that felt, on good days, like being held. As Mineko moved through her early years of training, one thing became clear to everyone around her. She was not simply good. She was exceptional. Her dance had a quality that was difficult to name precisely, but easy to see. There was a stillness inside her movement, a sense of intention that reached further than technique. When she danced, something in the room shifted slightly. Her teachers noticed. Madame Oima noticed. And quietly, without being told directly, Mineko noticed too. She did not speak of it. That would have been inappropriate and also unnecessary. But she was aware that what she was able to do was not what everyone could do. And that awareness sharpened her practice rather than relaxing it. She did not rest on what came naturally. She pressed into it. She wanted to know how far it could go. Kyoto in those years was a city of layered realities. In one part of the city, the modern world was arriving. New buildings, new fashions, young people moving through the streets with a lightness that came from prosperity and change. And in another part, in the narrow lanes of Gion Kobu, women in kimono walked carefully between the old wooden Ochaya, the tea houses, carrying the same arts their predecessors had carried for generations. These two worlds occupied the same city, but seemed to exist in different time entirely. Mineko moved through both, to some degree. She was a child of post-war Japan. She knew the modern world existed. She could see it. But her daily life was lived almost entirely within the older world. The schedule of the hanamachi was organized around its own calendar. There were annual performances, the Miyako Odori, or Cherry Blossom Dance, which is the famous spring performance that Gion Kobu Geiko and Maiko have staged every April for well over a century. There were seasonal banquets, specific events tied to the old lunar calendar, ceremonies that had been observed in the same form for so long that their origins were no longer precisely known. Mineko absorbed all of it. The entire texture of this world became hers. By the time she was in her early teens, the shape of her future was becoming clearer. She was preparing to make her debut as a Maiko. This is one of the most significant transitions in a young geisha's life. It is called the Misadashi. It is a formal introduction to the hanamachi, a public presentation that announces, here is someone new. Here is someone who is ready to begin. The preparation for the Misadashi was itself intensive. The kimono had to be chosen and fitted with care. The hair, worn in an elaborate traditional style for Maiko, had to be dressed correctly. The makeup, which is striking and very specific, had to be learned and applied. Maiko wear a distinctive white foundation on their faces and necks. Their lips are painted in a particular style. Their eyes are defined in a way that reflects the classical aesthetics of a much earlier Japan. All of it had to be practiced until it felt second nature. And then, when everything was ready, when every detail had been attended to, there was the debut itself. The Maiko would visit the various Ochaya of Gion Kobu, moving from tea house to tea house, accompanied by her Oni-san, the senior Geiko assigned to guide and mentor her through this first period of public life. The relationship between a Maiko and her One-san is significant. It is formal in structure, but personal in practice. The senior woman teaches by example. She shows the junior how to carry herself in a room, how to manage the pace of an evening, how to handle the various situations that arise in the world of the ozashiki. For Mineko, this relationship would prove to be an important one. Her Oni-san was a woman of considerable experience and standing in the hanamachi. Being guided by someone of that caliber mattered. It gave Mineko access to a kind of knowledge that could not be found in any lesson. Her misadashi took place when she was around 15 years old. The day of a misadashi is long and carefully choreographed. There are many tea houses to visit, many introductions to be made. The young Maiko must maintain her composure and her grace through hours of these formal meetings. It is, in some ways, an endurance exercise, as much as a celebration. Mineko moved through it with the steadiness that those who knew her had already come to expect. She was not visibly nervous, or if she was, she did not show it in any way that those around her could easily detect. What she felt internally was something she rarely spoke of directly. But there is something in the accounts of those who knew her that suggests she met that day with a kind of settled readiness, as if she had been moving toward it for so long that arriving at it felt less like a beginning than a continuation. The hanamachi received her, and her life as a Maiko formally began. The life of a Maiko is full in a way that is hard to describe from the outside. The days are long, the evenings are longer. Morning practice comes first, always. Dance, music, the various disciplines that never stop being refined, no matter how many years a woman has been studying them. Then the afternoon brings lessons and preparation. And then, as the light fades over the old rooftops of Gion, the evening begins. The Ochaya, the tea houses, come alive at night. Guests arrive. Business is conducted. Conversations unfold over carefully prepared meals and quiet cups of sake. And the Maiko and Geiko move through these rooms, playing music, dancing when asked, talking, listening, making the atmosphere of the evening what it needs to be. It sounds, described this way, almost simple. It is not simple at all. The skill required to manage an ozashiki, a banquet gathering, is subtle and deep. Every room is different. Every group of guests brings its own dynamic. Some evenings are formal and quiet. Others are relaxed and playful. Some guests want music. Others want conversation. Some want to be drawn out. Others want to be left in a certain comfortable silence. Reading all of that correctly, in real time, without being obvious about it. This is what separates a competent Maiko from a truly gifted one. Mineko was, from early on, gifted. She moved through the ozashiki with a quality that guests noticed and remembered. It was not simply her beauty, though she was beautiful in the particular way that the Maiko aesthetic cultivates. The elaborate kimono, the dressed hair, the painted face that seems to belong to an older and more formal world. It was something beneath the surface of all that. There was an attentiveness in her, a quality of genuine presence. When she was in a room, she was fully in that room, not performing presence, but actually inhabiting it. Guests felt seen by her in a way that was not intrusive. She did not flatter people in the obvious way. She did not perform warmth she did not feel. What she offered was something more restrained and, for that reason, more real. People came back to the Ochaya to see her specifically. This is the measure of success in the hanamachi. Not awards or titles, though those matter too, but the simple fact of being sought out, being requested, being the reason a particular guest chooses a particular tea house on a particular evening. Mineko was becoming that kind of presence, and she was still very young. The Miyako Odori arrived each spring like a fixed point in the calendar of Gion Kobu. The cherry blossom dance, as it is sometimes called in translation, is a large-scale public performance staged by the Geiko and Maiko of the district. It runs for the entire month of April. Multiple performances each day. Audiences come from across Japan, and increasingly in those years, from other parts of the world. For a Maiko, performing in the Miyako Odori is a serious and significant event. The choreography is elaborate. The costumes are magnificent. The staging involves the entire community of the hanamachi working together in a single coordinated effort. Mineko rehearsed for the Miyako Odori with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. She was a precise rehearser. She did not coast on natural ability. She worked each section of the choreography until it was fully her own, until the movement came not from memory alone, but from somewhere deeper than memory. When the performances began, she was composed. The lights, the audience, the scale of it, none of these things appeared to unsettle her. She moved as she had always moved in practice, clean and settled and completely present. Those who watched her during those spring performances in her early years as a Maiko began to say things that went beyond ordinary praise. They said she had something, a quality. In Japanese aesthetic tradition, there is a concept called Johaku. It describes the pacing and internal rhythm of a performance, a slow gathering, a breaking open, an acceleration toward completion. Great performers are said to embody this rhythm naturally, without imposing it. Mineko embodied it. Away from the stages and the ozashiki, her life was quieter. The Okiya was home. It had its own small routines that bookended the larger events of the professional calendar. Meals taken together. The particular sounds of a house full of women at different stages of their training. The older Geiko coming and going. The younger Maiko practicing in whatever spare moments the day allowed. Mineko had friendships within this world. They were perhaps not the easy, unguarded friendships of ordinary schoolgirls. The hanamachi was a competitive environment in certain ways, and relationships within it carried that awareness. But there were women she was genuinely close to, women whose company she valued and sought out in the quieter hours. She was also, by her own account, a reader. This is one of the lesser-known details of her life that feels worth holding on to. In the intervals between training and engagements, she read. She had a curiosity about the world beyond the hanamachi, about history, about ideas, about the way things worked in places and times she would never directly experience. It gave her an inner life that ran alongside her professional one, a private self that was not visible in the ozashiki, not relevant to the dance stage, but very much present and active beneath everything. That interior dimension was, in some ways, what would eventually lead her out. But that is still some years away. As Mineko moved deeper into her years as a Maiko, her reputation continued to grow. Word of mouth in the hanamachi travels in particular ways. The Ochaya communicate with one another. The patrons who move between different tea houses carry their impressions with them, and the impression that Mineko was leaving was consistent. She was serious. She was skilled. She was developing into something beyond what her teachers had initially hoped for, which had already been considerable. Madame Oima watched this with satisfaction and with care. She understood what Mineko was becoming, and she understood that managing that kind of talent required a particular kind of attention, not interference, not excessive direction, but a watchful presence that ensured the conditions remained right for something exceptional to continue growing. The relationship between them deepened during these years. It was not warm in a simple or easy way. Oima was not a demonstrative woman. She expressed approval through expectation, through continuing to ask more of Mineko, through trusting her with greater responsibility, through holding her to a standard that she did not apply to everyone. Mineko understood this. She had grown up inside this language of expectation and knew how to read it. Japan itself was changing rapidly around her. The 1960s brought economic growth on a scale that transformed daily life for most Japanese people. Consumer goods, new architecture, a young generation moving through a world of possibility that their parents could not have imagined. Tokyo was at the center of much of this change. Kyoto was quieter, as it tends to be, more attached to its own long identity. But even in Kyoto, the modern world was pressing in. Tourism was growing. Foreign visitors were arriving with greater frequency. Japan was opening outward in ways that brought new eyes to old things, including the hanamachi. For the geisha districts, this was complicated. On one hand, interest from the outside world brought a kind of visibility and prestige. The arts and culture of the hanamachi were being recognized as something significant, something worth preserving and presenting to a wider audience. On the other hand, that visibility brought misunderstanding, misconceptions about what geisha were and what they did. A tendency in Western imagination, in particular, to conflate the geisha with something quite different, with a world of transaction and availability that had nothing to do with the actual practice of the art. This misunderstanding would follow Mineko throughout her life. It was something she was aware of from a relatively young age, and it was something that, in time, she would feel compelled to address directly. By the time she reached her late teens, she had completed her years as a Maiko and made the transition to full Geiko status. This transition is marked by a ceremony called the erikai, the turning of the collar. It refers to the change in the collar worn with the kimono. A Maiko wears a red embroidered collar. A Geiko wears white. The shift is simple and visible and deeply meaningful to those who understand what it represents. It marks the end of apprenticeship, the beginning of professional life in full. For Mineko, the erikai was a significant moment. She had worked toward it for years. She had earned it completely. And yet, arriving at it brought not only satisfaction, but also a new kind of weight. As a Maiko, she had been developing, growing, allowed the latitude that comes with being in training. As a Geiko, she was fully accountable for everything she did. There was no more apprenticeship to shelter behind. Every performance, every evening, every encounter in the ozashiki was now a direct reflection of who she was and what she was capable of. She accepted this weight without apparent difficulty. It was, in its way, what she had been preparing for all along. Her early years as a Geiko confirmed what her Maiko years had suggested. She was not simply one of the talented Geiko of Gion Kobu. She was becoming the most sought after, the most requested, the name that appeared most frequently in the reservation books of the best Ochaya. This was not a title anyone formally awarded. It was simply what the numbers showed and what the people of the hanamachi, the Ochaya owners, the older Geiko, the patrons of long standing, quietly acknowledged among themselves. Mineko Iwasaki was the finest Geiko working in Gion Kobu. That recognition brought with it a full schedule, long evenings, a constant presence at the most significant engagements, requests from patrons of great importance, business leaders, politicians, artists, foreign dignitaries who visited Kyoto and were brought by their hosts to experience the hanamachi at its best. She met an enormous range of people during these years, people of great wealth and influence, people of creative distinction, people from Japan and from other parts of the world who came to Kyoto carrying their own ideas about what they were about to experience, and who often left with those ideas quietly rearranged. Among those who visited Gion Kobu during this period was the author James Meishner, and later, more significantly for the shape of Mineko's later life, the author Arthur Golden would draw on conversations with her in the research for a novel that would eventually reach an audience of millions. But that is a story for later. What mattered in those years was the work itself, the relentless accumulation of evenings, the refinement that only comes from doing something thousands of times in real conditions, the deepening of skills that had begun in childhood and were now being tested at the highest level. Mineko's dance continued to develop during this period. If anything, the quality of her movement became more interior as she matured, less about technical display and more about something that is harder to name, a kind of resonance, a depth of feeling expressed through the precise vocabulary of classical form. Her teachers spoke of this. In the Inoue school, the highest praise is not given for technical perfection, though technical perfection is expected. It is given for something that lies beyond technique, for the moment when form and feeling become indistinguishable from one another. Mineko was reaching toward that, and in her best performances, those who watched believed she arrived there. The spring performances of the Miyako Odori each year became, in part, occasions to see her. Audiences attended with that specific hope, and she met it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too little, but from doing too much for too long at too high a level. It does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates slowly, the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of still water, layer by layer, so gradually that for a long time you cannot see it happening. And then one day, the water is no longer clear, and you understand that it has been clouding for some time without your noticing. Mineko would not reach that point for several more years, but the conditions for it were being laid down during this period of her greatest professional success. The schedule was relentless. There is no softer word for it. A sought-after Geiko in Gion Kobu during the height of the season might work every evening for weeks without interruption. The engagements began in the early evening and could extend well past midnight. Then there were the daytime rehearsals and lessons that did not stop, simply because the evenings were full. Mineko maintained this pace with outward composure. She did not complain. Complaining was not part of the culture she had been raised in, and it was not part of her own character either. But she was human, and the demands on her were not ordinary. The Ochaya she worked in most frequently during these years were among the finest in Gion Kobu. The Ochaya, the tea house, is not a restaurant exactly, though food is served. It is not a bar, though sake and other drinks are part of the evening. It is something that does not have a precise equivalent in other cultures. It is a place of curated experience. The Ochaya owner, usually a woman called the Okami, manages everything. She knows her guests. She knows their preferences and their histories, and the kinds of evenings that will suit them. She chooses which Geiko and Maiko to invite for each engagement based on a careful reading of who will fit well with whom. Being chosen frequently by the best Okami for the most significant engagements is itself a form of professional recognition. Mineko was chosen constantly. The Okami trusted her in difficult rooms, with guests who were demanding or particular, or who required a specific quality of attention. With evenings that carried weight, important business negotiations conducted in the traditional atmosphere of the ozashiki, diplomatic occasions, celebrations of genuine significance in the lives of powerful people. She handled all of it. The guests she encountered during these years came from every part of Japanese society and from increasingly far beyond it. Japan in the late 1960s and into the 70s was a country of growing international presence. Japanese business was expanding. The country's cultural prestige was rising. Kyoto was drawing visitors of considerable distinction. Mineko moved through these encounters with the same quality of attention she brought to everything. She was curious about people in a contained way. She observed them carefully. She did not impose herself on an evening, but she shaped it nonetheless. There were guests she genuinely enjoyed. People of wit and intelligence and real curiosity who came to the ozashiki not simply for the performance of it, but for the actual pleasure of the conversation and the company. And there were guests who were difficult, who misunderstood what the hanamachi was, or who brought attitudes toward Geiko that were reductive or dismissive, or worse. Mineko handled these situations too, with a composure that was itself a form of skill. She did not show offense. She did not allow an evening to collapse into awkwardness if she could prevent it. She steered things quietly, almost invisibly, back towards something more acceptable. This was not always easy, and it was one of the things that, over time, wore on her in ways she did not immediately name. The question of what geisha were was one that Mineko thought about seriously. She had grown up inside the tradition. She knew its depth, its history, its genuine artistic rigor. She knew what it required of a woman who practiced it at the highest level, and she knew how far the outside world's understanding of it fell from the reality. The misconceptions were not new. They had existed for generations. Western visitors in particular had long arrived in Japan carrying ideas about geisha that owed more to imagination and rumor than to fact. But in an era of growing international contact, those misconceptions were becoming more visible and more consequential. Mineko found this genuinely troubling, not for abstract reasons but for personal ones. She had given her life to this tradition. She had entered it as a small child and shaped herself entirely around its demands and its ideals. The art she practiced was real and serious and demanded everything she had. To have it misunderstood, reduced to something it was not, was a kind of injury that she carried quietly but did not forget. It would eventually move her to speak, but that moment was still some years away. In the meantime, the work continued. The Miyako Odori each spring, the evening engagements through the year, the rehearsals and lessons that never stopped, the slow calendar of the hanamachi turning through its seasons. There were moments of genuine beauty in all of it. Mineko was not someone who idealized her life or her circumstances. She saw them clearly, but she also experienced, in the practice of her art, moments that were genuinely extraordinary. Performances where everything aligned: the music, the movement, the room, the quality of attention in the audience. And something happened that was larger than the sum of its parts. Those moments existed. They were real. And they mattered to her in a way that no amount of exhaustion or frustration could entirely erase. There was also the question of the future. In the hanamachi, women who rose to a certain level of prominence sometimes took on greater roles within the institution itself. They might become the head of an Okiya. They might mentor younger women with particular seriousness. They might become increasingly important to the governance and preservation of the district's traditions. Madame Oima was aging. The question of succession, of who would carry the Iwasaki house forward, was not spoken of constantly, but it was present. It hung in the atmosphere of the Okiya in the particular way that important unspoken things do. Oima had shaped Mineko as a successor. That had been the intention from early on. Mineko had understood this without being told directly. It was written into the structure of how she had been trained, what she had been expected to carry, what the Iwasaki name was being prepared to mean in her hands. But Mineko was beginning to have thoughts of her own about this. Not rebellion, nothing so direct or dramatic, but a quiet uncertainty, a growing awareness of something she could not yet fully name. She had given everything to the hanamachi since the age of 3. She had done so willingly, with genuine commitment, without serious reservation. And yet, somewhere in those years of full professional life, a question had begun to form. Not what am I doing, but what am I allowed to want for myself? It is worth saying something about the structure of life within the hanamachi more directly. A Geiko's earnings were significant. Mineko, as the most sought-after Geiko in Gion Kobu, was generating considerable income through her engagements. But the system through which those earnings flowed was complex and old. The Okiya received payment for the Geiko's appearances. The Geiko herself received a portion. But there were obligations, financial and otherwise, that ran through the whole arrangement. The cost of training, of kimono, of all the years of preparation that the Okiya had invested, created a kind of ledger that shaped the economics of a Geiko's professional life in ways that were not always transparent. Mineko was aware of this. She was not, by nature, someone who ignored practical realities. She was precise about most things, and the financial dimensions of her situation was something she paid attention to. What she discovered, as she looked more closely at the economics of the hanamachi, troubled her. The system as it operated was not always fair to the women who were its most essential participants. The Geiko and Maiko, who generated the income, who performed the arts, who maintained the tradition through their daily labor. They did not always receive what the logic of that labor suggested they should. This was not a new problem. It was structural. It had been built into the system over a very long time. But for Mineko, seeing it clearly was significant. It added another layer to the quiet question she was already asking about what her future inside this world might look like. During this period, her public profile was growing in ways that extended beyond the hanamachi itself. She was known, among those who moved in the circles that touched the geisha world, as someone extraordinary, a name that carried real weight, a Geiko whose performances people traveled to Kyoto specifically to experience. She was also, by this point, someone that significant visitors to Japan were brought to meet. The hanamachi has always served a function in Japanese cultural diplomacy that is not always acknowledged openly. When important guests come to Kyoto, guests whose hosts want to offer them something that represents the deepest and most refined layers of Japanese culture, a banquet at a fine Ochaya is often part of that experience. Mineko was present at many such evenings. She met people of great distinction across these years: artists, scholars, business figures, political visitors from other countries. She observed them all with that quality of contained attention that was characteristic of her. She did not speak of these encounters in detail for many years. The ozashiki operates under a tradition of discretion. What happens in those rooms is not shared publicly. Guests trust that their evenings there are private. Mineko honored that tradition completely throughout her professional life. Even in her later years, when she wrote and spoke about her experiences, she maintained careful limits around the private lives of those she had known in the ozashiki. That discretion was itself a form of integrity, and it was one she never abandoned. The years moved through their seasons. Spring brought the miyako odori, always. The preparations, the rehearsals, the performances themselves filling all of April. Summer brought the Gion Matsuri, one of the great festivals of Kyoto, which transforms the city for weeks and draws enormous crowds to the streets and shrines of the district. Autumn brought a different quality of engagements. The evenings cooler, the light changing over the rooftops, guests arriving with the particular mood that autumn in Kyoto tends to produce. Something reflective, slightly melancholy in the best possible sense. Winter was quieter in some ways, but the lead-up to the new year brought its own density of social occasions, its own rituals of closure and preparation. Through all of it, Mineko worked. She was, by her mid-20s, at the absolute height of her powers. Her dance had reached a level that her teachers described as genuinely rare. Her presence in the ozashiki was sought after by the most significant patrons in the hanamachi. Her name was the Iwasaki name, and she wore it with everything she had. And she was quietly, slowly, becoming tired. Not tired in the simple sense. Not the tiredness that a good night of sleep resolves. This was the deeper kind, the kind that accumulates in a person who has been operating at full intensity for most of their remembered life, with very little space that was genuinely their own. There were things she had not done. This is a quiet fact about a life lived inside such total commitment to a single world. She had not had the ordinary experiences of a young woman in Japan in that era. She had not moved freely through the city in the way that other young women did. She had not had the unstructured time that most people take for granted. Evenings with no obligation, mornings with nowhere particular to be. She had not built a life outside the Okiya in any ordinary sense. Everything she was, professionally and in many ways personally, existed within the structure that had formed her since early childhood. There is a particular kind of loneliness that can live inside a life of great external fullness. Mineko knew something of that loneliness. She did not speak of it easily, but it was there, threading quietly through the years of professional triumph and public recognition. And it was, along with everything else she was beginning to see and feel and question, part of what was slowly building toward a decision that would surprise everyone around her. The decision did not arrive all at once. That is rarely how the most significant decisions come. They tend to form gradually, the way a shape forms slowly in fog, present long before it becomes visible, and then suddenly clear in a way that makes it seem inevitable. For Mineko, the question of leaving had been forming for years before she allowed herself to look at it directly. She was in her mid-20s. She was at the peak of everything the hanamachi could offer. There was nowhere higher to go within this world. She had already arrived at the place that most Geiko spend their entire careers working toward, and some never reach at all. And yet, the word that keeps appearing in accounts of this period of her life is constraint, not in a dramatic sense, not as a grievance or a complaint, but as a simple reality that she was increasingly unable to ignore. The hanamachi was a complete world. That had always been both its appeal and its limitation. It gave everything to the women who devoted themselves to it, and it asked for everything in return. What it asked for, most fundamentally, was the whole of a woman's life, her time, her earnings, flowing through systems she did not fully control, her choices about where to go and when and with whom, her future, shaped by the expectations of succession and institutional continuity, rather than by anything she herself might want. Mineko had accepted all of this for most of her life without serious question. But she was questioning now. There was also the matter of what she had seen and experienced in the ozashiki over many years. She had met thousands of guests by this point. She had observed the full range of what people brought into those intimate rooms, the good and the thoughtful, and the genuinely curious, and the careless, the presumptuous, the occasionally hostile. She had seen the ways in which the Geiko's position, despite the artistry, despite the training, despite the genuine cultural significance of what these women did, could be misread and diminished by people who did not understand it and did not particularly wish to. She had managed all of this with composure for years. But composure is not the same as acceptance. Beneath the surface of all those carefully navigated evenings, something had been accumulating, a sense of something unresolved, a feeling that the story being told about geisha, even within Japan, even within the world that was supposed to understand, was not fully true, and that the women most affected by that untrue story had very little power to correct it. Mineko was not powerless in any ordinary sense. She was the most prominent Geiko of her generation. She had influence within the hanamachi. She was heard when she spoke, but there were limits to what could be changed from inside. She understood that. She also understood, with increasing clarity, that her body had limits. The physical demands of a Geiko's life are considerable and rarely discussed. The kimono itself is physically restrictive. Worn correctly, it shapes the body in ways that are aesthetically precise and physiologically demanding. The obi wound tightly around the waist, the particular posture required, the geta, The elevated wooden sandals that Maiko wear, which alter the walk and place, sustain pressure on specific parts of the foot. Years of this leave marks on the body that are not visible from the outside. Mineko had been wearing kimono, and before that, the more elaborate dress of a Maiko, since childhood. Her body had been shaped by this practice for decades. She was also a dancer of great technical demands. The Inoue school choreography requires full physical commitment. The movements are subtle, but they are not gentle in terms of what they ask of the body over time. By her mid-20s, she was aware of things that her body was telling her, not in any catastrophic way, but as a quiet, insistent set of signals that she was paying attention to with growing seriousness. A woman who retires at 29 from the kind of physical and professional demands she had sustained would not be making an irrational choice. She would be making a realistic one. Madame Wima's health had also begun to decline during this period. The woman who had shaped Mineko's life, who had seen something in a 3-year-old child and decided to cultivate it, was aging. The energy and authority that had defined her presence in the Okiya were diminishing, slowly but visibly. This was painful for Mineko in a way that was difficult to articulate. Her relationship with Oima had never been simple. It had been formal and demanding, and shaped by the enormous power imbalance that exists between a child and the adult who controls her world. There had been moments of genuine hardness in it, but there had also been something that mattered enormously. A recognition that had been extended to Mineko at the very beginning and had never been withdrawn. A belief in what she was capable of that had shaped everything. Whatever its complications, the relationship had been one of the most significant of Mineko's life. Watching Oima age brought its own form of grief, and it also sharpened the question of what Mineko owed to the institution versus what she was permitted to want for herself. She was also, during these years, forming a life outside the hanamachi in ways that were small but significant. She had met a man. His name was Jinichiro Sato. He was an artist, a painter. He moved in different circles from the world of the hanamachi, and he was, in his way, as absorbed in his own practice as Mineko was in hers. The relationship developed slowly and quietly, as most things in Mineko's life tended to do. She did not speak of it publicly. The hanamachi was not a world that accommodated romantic attachment easily, especially for a Geiko of her prominence. The expectations around personal life were strict, and she was too private by nature to make anything about her inner life visible if she could avoid it. But the relationship was real, and it added another dimension to the question she was already asking. If she stayed in the hanamachi, there were limits on what a life with Jinichiro could look like. The demands of her professional world were total in the ways that have already been described. A Geiko at her level of prominence had very little space that was simply hers. A future that included something more ordinary, a home of her own choosing, a relationship lived without the constant pressure of institutional expectation, required stepping out of the world she had inhabited since before she could properly remember. The decision crystallized in the mid-1970s. Mineko was 29 years old. She announced her retirement from the hanamachi. The announcement was not made with drama. That was not her way. It was communicated through the proper channels, in the proper manner, with the composure that had always characterized her public presence. But its impact was considerable. In Gion Kobu, the news moved through the district with the particular speed that significant things travel in small, close communities. She was, at that moment, the most prominent Geiko in Kyoto, possibly in all of Japan. Her retirement was not simply the end of one woman's career. It was the departure of someone who had come to embody, for many people inside and outside the hanamachi, what the tradition was capable of producing. Some people were shocked. Some were saddened. Some, who knew her well enough to have seen the quiet accumulation of her discontent, were not surprised. She had served the Iwasaki house and the hanamachi for more than 2 decades. She had entered as a child of 3. She was leaving as a woman of 29. The years in between had been filled with a quality of commitment and labor and genuine artistic achievement that almost no one who has not lived inside such a world can fully appreciate from the outside. She had danced on the stage of the Miyako Odori more times than she could easily count. She had sat in hundreds of ozashiki. She had played music and poured sake, and managed evenings and navigated encounters with an enormous range of people. She had trained for years before any of that began, and she had continued to train throughout all of it. She had been, for a sustained period, the finest practitioner of her art in the most prestigious district of the most artistically significant city in Japan. And she had decided, quietly and completely, that it was enough. The retirement itself was followed by a period of adjustment that she has described in general terms as genuinely difficult. Leaving a world that has been your entire life since early childhood does not simply free you, it also unmoors you. The structure that the hanamachi had provided, the schedule, the expectations, the clear daily purpose, had shaped everything about how Mineko moved through time. And now that structure was gone. She found herself, for the first time in her life, without a role already determined for her. This was both a liberation and a disorientation. She was free, and freedom, when you have not had much of it, takes some time to learn how to inhabit. She married Jinichiro Sato. The marriage was quiet and private, as she preferred. She moved into a life that was, by the standards of what she had known, remarkably ordinary. A home, a husband, time that was her own, mornings that did not begin with practice before the light had fully arrived. She found that she valued this ordinary life. She also found that she missed things. Not the exhaustion, not the relentless pace, not the aspects of the hanamachi system that had troubled her, but the art itself, the dance, the particular quality of attention that comes from performing at the highest level in front of people who understand what they are seeing, that she missed. It did not make her regret the decision, but it clarified something about who she was. She had not simply been playing a role for 26 years. She had been genuinely herself in the practice of that art. The art was not something she had picked up and put down. It was constitutive. It was part of what she was made of. And leaving the institutional world of the hanamachi did not change that. She spent the early years of her retirement in relative privacy. She was not a public figure in the way she had been. The visibility that had accompanied her professional life faded, as it tends to do when a person steps away from the thing that generated it. She did not seek attention. She had never sought it in the first place. She thought. She read. She spent time with her husband and built the quiet domestic life she had not previously had access to. She also, during these years, continued to think seriously about the tradition she had left. Not with bitterness. The picture is more complicated than that. She understood the hanamachi deeply. She understood its beauty and its historical significance, and what it gave to the women who practiced within it at the highest level. And she understood its flaws, its structural inequities, the ways in which the women at the center of it were not always protected or respected in the ways that the tradition's artistry seemed to demand. She held both of these things at once, without needing to resolve the contradiction into something simpler. And then, in the early 1990s, something happened that would draw her back into public life in a way she had not anticipated. A writer came to Kyoto. His name was Arthur Golden. He was an American author, conducting research for a novel he was writing. A novel set in the world of the Geisha, a work of fiction that he intended to be grounded in real knowledge of the hanamachi and its traditions. He sought out Mineko Iwasaki. Given her reputation, her prominence, her unique position as someone who had lived inside that world at its highest level and then stepped out of it, she was an obvious person to speak with. She agreed to speak with him. The conversations that followed were extensive. She shared with him the texture of the life she had lived, the details of training and performance, and the interior world of the hanamachi, the things that outsiders consistently misunderstood, the things that were genuinely remarkable and worth communicating to a wider audience. She did this, by her own account, because she wanted the story of Geisha to be told accurately. That had been her concern for years. The misunderstanding, the reduction, the false image that persisted in the outside world. If a widely read novel could correct some of that, could offer a more truthful picture of what the tradition actually was, then perhaps it was worth contributing to. That was her intention. What followed was not what she had intended at all. Arthur Golden's novel was published in 1997. It was called Memoirs of a Geisha. The book was an immediate and enormous success. It reached readers in dozens of countries. It was translated into many languages. It spent a long time on bestseller lists and was eventually adapted into a major Hollywood film. For many people around the world, it became the primary lens through which they understood geisha culture, the primary story, the defining image. And Mineko Iwasaki read it. What she found inside it was not what she had hoped for. The novel presented its geisha protagonist in ways that Mineko found deeply inaccurate, not in small incidental details, but in fundamental characterizations. The world depicted in the book was not the world she had described. The women in it did not resemble the women she had known. The practices attributed to geisha in the novel reflected precisely the kinds of misconceptions that she had spent years troubled by. The book also acknowledged her by name in its author's note. Golden credited her assistance and her willingness to share her experiences. This was the part that cut most deeply. Her name was attached to a portrayal she found false, a portrayal that she felt would confirm and deepen the very misunderstandings she had hoped the novel might correct. She had given her testimony in good faith. She had shared what she knew with the intention of accuracy. and what had emerged bore, in her view, very little relationship to the reality she had tried to convey. The response she chose was not silence. Mineko Iwasaki had been private for most of her adult life. She had honored the discretion of the hanamachi scrupulously. She had not sought public attention or used her prominence as a platform. But this was different. This was her life, her world, the tradition she had given everything to. And it was being misrepresented to millions of people, with her name attached to the misrepresentation. She decided to write her own account. The book she produced was published in Japan in 2002. Its English translation appeared under the title Geisha, A Life. It was her story, told in her own words, from her own perspective, with her own understanding of what the hanamachi was and what it was not. The writing of it was not a simple undertaking. She was a Geiko, not a writer. The discipline that had defined her life was physical and performative, not literary. Putting her experience into words, finding a way to translate the texture of a world that operates largely through presence and practice into something that could be communicated on a page, required a different kind of effort than anything she had previously attempted. But she brought to it the same quality of attention and precision that she had brought to everything else. She was not interested in settling scores. She was not interested in making the book an argument or a grievance. She wanted to tell the truth about what the life had been. The book she wrote is a remarkable document for several reasons. It is specific in the way that only first-hand knowledge can produce. The details of daily life in the Okiya, the rhythms of the hanamachi across different seasons, the texture of particular relationships and particular moments, all of it carries the weight of lived experience. It is also honest about the difficulties, about the aspects of the hanamachi system that she had found troubling, about the inequities, about the physical demands, about the particular kind of loneliness that can exist inside a life of such total professional dedication. She did not romanticize what she had lived. She did not present the hanamachi as a lost paradise. She saw it as it was, something of genuine beauty and genuine complexity, containing both great artistry and real human cost. And she did not pretend that leaving had been uncomplicated. The book is honest about the difficulty of the transition, about the disorientation of stepping out of the only world she had ever known. What it offers, above all, is clarity. A clear-eyed account from someone who had been fully inside something that most people only see from far outside, and who had the intelligence and the courage to describe what she had found there. The legal dimension of this period was also significant. Mineko filed a lawsuit against Arthur Golden and his publisher. Her claim was that she had spoken to Golden under an assurance of confidentiality, that her contribution to his research would not be attributed to her by name. The attribution in the author's note, she argued, had violated that understanding, and the content of the novel had caused her reputational harm in Japan, where she was known and where the hanamachi's culture of discretion was taken seriously. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court. The terms were not made public, but the fact of it was significant in itself. Mineko had not simply absorbed the situation quietly. She had pursued a remedy through the proper legal channels, with the same directness that had always characterized her when something genuinely mattered to her. She'd been quiet for a long time. about a great many things. But there were limits. The publication of her memoir brought her a new kind of public attention. Interviews, appearances, requests from journalists and documentary makers, and people who wanted to understand the hanamachi from someone who had actually lived inside it. She engaged with some of this and declined much of it. She was still a private person. The book had not transformed her into someone who sought the spotlight. It had simply been a necessary act, a setting of the record, a reclamation of her own story from the version of it that had been circulating without her consent. Having done that, she was not particularly interested in the further amplifications that public attention tends to offer. She gave interviews selectively. She spoke to people who seemed genuinely interested in the tradition and its history, rather than those who wanted the more sensational dimensions of the story. And she continued to live her private life with her husband in Kyoto, in the city that had always been her home. She also remained connected to the arts she had practiced. She did not perform publicly. That chapter was closed. But she taught the transmission of traditional arts depends entirely on the willingness of those who have mastered them to pass the knowledge forward. Without that willingness, the chain breaks. The art diminishes or disappears. Mineko understood this, and she took the responsibility of transmission seriously. She worked with younger women who were learning the arts of the hanamachi. She shared what she knew, not in any grand or formal way, but with the patient specificity of someone who had spent a lifetime refining the very things she was now passing on. This mattered to her. Whatever her complicated feelings about the institution of the hanamachi, the arts themselves were something she had always held apart. The dance, the music, the refined aesthetics of a tradition with centuries of depth, these were not implicated in the system's flaws. They were something separate, something worth preserving. And she was one of the few people alive who understood them at the level at which they could be fully transmitted. The film adaptation of Memoirs of a Geisha was released in 2005. It brought a new wave of attention to the subject and a new wave of controversy. The film cast Chinese actresses in the roles of Japanese geisha, which provoked significant criticism in Japan. The cultural specificity of the hanamachi, so bound up with the particular history and aesthetics of Kyoto, felt, to many Japanese observers, poorly served by this choice. Mineko was publicly critical. She did not mince her words on this point. The hanamachi was a specifically Japanese tradition. Its art, its history, its meaning were all inseparable from that specificity. To have it represented in a major global production without appropriate cultural fidelity was, in her view, a continuation of the same failure of understanding that the novel had embodied. Her criticism was noted. The controversy around the film was significant and prolonged. And once again, her name was at the center of a public conversation about what the geisha tradition actually was and what it deserved from those who chose to represent it. What is worth noticing about this period of her life is the consistency of her position throughout it. From the moment she retired, to the moment she published her memoir, to the moment she spoke out about the film, the thread running through all of it was the same. She wanted accuracy, not a flattering account, not a romanticized version, not a polished cultural export designed to appeal to international audiences on their own terms. accuracy. She wanted people to understand what geisha actually were, what the tradition actually demanded, what the women who practiced it at the highest level actually experienced in their daily lives. This insistence on accuracy was not simply a personal preference. It came from the same place as everything else in her life, from the deep respect for craft that had been instilled in her since childhood, from the understanding that carelessness and imprecision are forms of disrespect, that to represent something poorly is to diminish it. She had spent her life in a tradition that did not tolerate imprecision. She applied that standard to the representation of the tradition itself. The years that followed the film's release settled into a quieter rhythm. The bursts of public attention faded, as they tend to do. Mineko returned to the life she had built, the private life in Kyoto, the marriage, the continued connection to the arts she had practiced, and the people who were carrying them forward. She was aging now in the particular way that people age when they have lived at very high intensity for a long period and then stepped into something slower. There is often a quality of hard-won settledness in such people, a sense of having arrived somewhere real, even if the route there had been more demanding than anticipated. Mineko had that quality. She had been precise and controlled and outwardly composed for most of her public life, and she remained composed. But in the accounts of those who encountered her in these later years, there is also something more relaxed, something that had not been fully present during the years of intense professional life. She had more room now, more space to simply be in the day, without the day being entirely structured around what the day required. She also remained a figure of genuine interest and respect within Japan. The hanamachi continued to exist, though it was smaller than it had been in Mineko's active years. The number of Geiko and Maiko in Gion Kobu had declined significantly from the post-war peak. Economic change, social change, the shifting patterns of Japanese entertainment and business culture, all of these had affected the district. But it was still there. The Miyako Odori still took place every April. The Ochaya still operated. The Inoue School of Dance still taught its demanding curriculum to the women who chose this path. And in that continuing world, Mineko's legacy was present. Not loudly, not in any formal or institutional way, but in the knowledge of what had been possible, in the standard she had set during her active years, in the particular quality of dance and presence that she had demonstrated could be achieved within this tradition. She represented something to the hanamachi, not just a great practitioner, but a kind of proof. Proof that the tradition, at its best, could produce something genuinely extraordinary. There is a question that her life raises quietly, without ever fully answering. It is the question of what it means to give everything to something. Mineko gave everything she had to the hanamachi for over 2 decades. She entered it as a child who had not yet formed an independent self. She shaped herself entirely around its demands. She reached the absolute summit of what it could offer. And then she left. And in leaving, she did not repudiate what she had given or what the giving had produced. She did not look back on those years as a loss or a mistake. But she also did not pretend that giving everything had cost nothing. It had cost her the ordinary shape of a young life. the freedoms that most people exercise without even noticing them, the chance to form herself in different ways, to pursue different interests, to belong to herself in the uncomplicated way that people who have not been wholly claimed by an institution tend to belong to themselves. Whether the exchange was worth it is not a question she answered simply. Or perhaps it is not a question that has a simple answer. What she said, in various ways and at various times, was closer to this. She had done what she was made to do. She had done it as well as it could be done. And she had, at a certain point, understood that continuing to do it was no longer the right choice for the person she was becoming. That is not a simple statement, but it is an honest one. In her later years, Mineko also spoke more openly about the aspects of her life that had been difficult. The lack of autonomy during her years in the hanamachi, the financial structures that she had found unjust, the experience of being misrepresented, and then of having to fight, publicly and legally, to reclaim her own story. She spoke of these things without self-pity. That is perhaps the most consistent quality across everything she said and wrote about her life. She did not cast herself as a victim. She did not minimize what had been hard. She described it plainly, with the same precision she applied to everything, and she moved on. There is something in that quality, the refusal of self-pity alongside the refusal of false positivity, that feels characteristic of who she was. She saw clearly. She spoke honestly, and she did not require the story to be simpler than it actually was. Kyoto itself aged alongside her, in its own way. The city had always held time differently from other places. Its relationship with the past was not nostalgic exactly. It was something more structural than that. The past was simply present there, woven into the physical fabric of the streets and buildings and seasonal rituals in a way that did not require anyone to make a conscious effort to maintain it. The temples were still there. The old wooden machiya townhouses still lined certain lanes. The moss in the garden of Ryowanji still grew in the particular patient way that moss grows when it has been undisturbed for a very long time. And in the hanamachi, the traditions continued, diminished in number, yes. The community of Geiko and Maiko was smaller than it had been in Mineko's active years. The social and economic conditions that had once sustained a larger hanamachi had shifted significantly. But smaller is not the same as gone. The Miyako Odori continued. The Ochaya continued. Young women still chose this path, still entered the Okiya, still submitted themselves to the long and demanding process of becoming something rare. Mineko watched this continuation with a feeling that was complex and genuine. She wanted the tradition to survive. She believed it deserved to survive. The arts at its center, the dance, the music, the particular aesthetic sensibility that had been refined over centuries, were worth preserving with great care. But she also wanted the survival to be honest. She did not want the hanamachi to persist as a kind of living museum, performing itself for tourists without the interior life that had always given the tradition its meaning. She wanted the women inside it to be treated fairly, to be compensated appropriately, to have the autonomy and the dignity that their labor and their artistry deserved. These were not demands she made loudly or constantly. They were positions she had arrived at through her own experience, and that she expressed, when asked, with clarity and without apology. There was also something she said in various interviews and in her memoir that is worth sitting with for a moment. She said that she did not regret becoming a Geiko. This might seem obvious, but given everything, the constraints, the exhaustion, the financial inequities, the public misrepresentation, it is worth taking seriously as a statement. She did not regret it. What she regretted, to the extent that she expressed regret at all, was not the life itself, but specific aspects of the system that had contained it. The structural things that could have been different without changing what was most essential about the tradition. The art itself she never regretted. She had loved the dance from the moment she saw it. As a 3-year-old child standing in an Okiya, she had no real framework for understanding. And she had loved it, in the particular complicated way that a master loves their art. For every year of her life since, the love had not faded with the retirement. It had simply changed its form. She no longer performed, but she carried the knowledge in her body, in the particular way she moved through a room, in the quality of attention she brought to watching others dance, in the standards she applied when she taught. The art was in her, in a way that could not be removed by leaving the institution that had originally housed it. She spoke occasionally about what she hoped people would understand about the Geisha tradition, not the surface of it, not the kimono and the white face paint and the elaborate hair, which are the images that tend to travel furthest and say the least. She wanted people to understand the depth of the training, the years of daily practice that underlie what looks, from the outside, like an evening of graceful ease. She wanted people to understand that the women of the hanamachi were artists in the full sense of the word, that the standards they were held to were as rigorous as those applied in any other serious artistic tradition, that what they did required the same quality of dedication and intelligence and lifelong refinement that any serious art demands. And she wanted people to understand that the human beings inside that tradition were fully human, with inner lives and private feelings and experiences that did not reduce to the aesthetic image they presented in the ozushiki or on the stage. She had been a human being inside an extraordinary role for her entire professional life. She had not disappeared into the role. She had always been there, behind it and within it, fully present. That, perhaps, is one of the things that had made her so exceptional at what she did. Her husband, Junichiro, remained a steady presence throughout these later years. Their life together had the quality that long marriages sometimes develop when both people have strong interior lives and a genuine respect for one another's separateness. They were not the same kind of person. He was an artist working in a very different medium, from a very different background, with a very different relationship to the public world. But there was between them a mutual understanding that seems to have been sustaining. Mineko, who had spent so many years moving through rooms full of people while remaining essentially private, had found in her marriage a space where the privacy could be something other than professional necessity. She did not speak of this in great detail. Privacy was, and remained, something she protected with care. But the sense of a life genuinely shared, of a home that was actually a home in the way the Okiya had never quite been, comes through in what she did say. It mattered to her. The ordinary warmth of it mattered. The geisha world she had left continued to draw scholarly and journalistic attention throughout the late 20th century and into the 21st. Researchers came to Kyoto. Documentarians came. People writing books and articles and academic papers on the history and sociology and aesthetics of the hanamachi came. Some of them sought out Mineko. She was selective about who she spoke with and how much she shared. But she did engage when she felt that the engagement was likely to produce something genuinely useful, something that would add to accurate understanding, rather than simply recirculating existing misconceptions in a new form. She had, after all, written her own account. It was available. Anyone who wanted to understand her experience from her own perspective had access to it. What she could offer beyond the book was the particular quality of her presence, the specificity of her memory, the way she could describe the feeling of a thing, the weight of a particular kimono, the sound of the shamisen in a small room late at night, the particular quality of attention that a full ozoshiki demanded, with the authority of someone who had actually been there, inside all of it, for decades. That kind of testimony is rare. It becomes rarer as time passes. She was also, in these later years, someone who had earned the right to be honest about the tradition's future. The hanamachi faced real challenges. The number of young women choosing to enter the Geiko and Maiko world had declined significantly from historical peaks. The economic model that had sustained the Ochaya for generations was under pressure. The clientele that had once filled those intimate rooms, the businessmen and politicians and figures of influence for whom a banquet at a fine tea house was a standard part of professional life, had changed in their habits and their expectations. The world the hanamachi had been built to serve was not the same world it now inhabited. This was not a crisis in the immediate sense. The tradition had shown remarkable resilience across centuries that had brought far more dramatic disruptions than the shifting tastes of a modern economy. But it was a genuine challenge, and Mineko spoke about it honestly when asked. She did not pretend that everything was fine simply because she loved the tradition. She did not offer false reassurance. She said that the hanamachi would need to find ways to adapt without sacrificing what was essential, that the arts at its center needed to be preserved with real seriousness, not simply performed as spectacle, that the women who chose this path deserved to be supported in ways that made the choice genuinely sustainable over a full professional life. These were not radical positions, but they were grounded in experience and expressed without sentimentality. There is something about the arc of Mineko Iwasaki's life that resists easy summary. It does not fit the shape of the stories we most commonly tell about women of her generation. It is not a story of simple oppression or simple triumph. It is not a story about a woman who overcame a limiting tradition, nor a story about a woman who was perfectly served by one. It is a story about someone who entered a particular world as a very small child, gave that world everything she had, became the finest practitioner of its arts in her generation, and then, at the point of absolute achievement, made the quiet and radical choice to belong to herself, and then spent the rest of her life trying to ensure that the record of what that world actually was, not the romantic version, not the simplified version, not the version that served other people's narratives, was told with accuracy. That is a specific and unusual life. It does not reduce to a lesson or a moral, but it does offer something a picture of what it looks like when a person brings complete seriousness to whatever they have chosen, when the standards applied to the work are high and held without compromise, when the commitment is real enough to last through decades of difficulty and still produce something extraordinary at the end of it. And a picture, too, of what it looks like when that same person decides, at a moment entirely of their own choosing, that the chapter is finished, not bitterly, not with regret for what the chapter contained, but with the quiet authority of someone who knows their own life well enough to recognize when one thing has ended and something else is ready to begin. Mineko Iwasaki spent her later decades in Kyoto, the city of her birth, the city of her entire professional life, the city whose particular quality of beauty, the moss gardens, the wooden lanes, the cherry blossoms arriving each April with the same faithful punctuality they had always shown, she had absorbed so deeply that it had become part of how she understood the world. She was in her 70s by the time the world had largely settled around her story. The controversy over the novel and the film had receded into the past. Her own memoir had found its readers. The record had been set, as she had needed it to be set, and the daily life of a woman in her later years in a quiet city had replaced the noise of all of that. She gardened, by some accounts. She read. She maintained the relationships she valued and let the rest fall away. She was not a person who needed a great deal of external confirmation. She had known, for most of her life, exactly what she was doing and how well she was doing it. She had not needed approval to sustain her. She had needed the work itself. And the work, in its various forms, had always been there. The tradition she had left behind continued to mark the seasons of Kyoto in its old way. Every April, the banners went up in Gion Kobu, announcing the Miyako Odori. The stage was prepared. The Maiko and Geiko rehearsed their parts. The audiences came, as they had always come, to sit in the old theatre and watch the dances that had been performed in that district for well over 100 years. The dances Mineko had performed so many times were still being performed. Different women now. Different faces beneath the white foundation. Different hands moving through the gestures of the Inoue school, but the same movements, the same music, the same slow accumulation of meaning that comes when something has been done with full attention, in the same form, for a very long time. There is a kind of continuity in that which has nothing to do with any individual life. The tradition holds what individual practitioners pass through it. Each woman who has danced on that stage has added something, however imperceptibly, to what the dance is, and each one has eventually stepped back, leaving the dance to continue without her. Mineko had been, for a period, the one through whom the dance moved most brilliantly, and she had stepped back, and the dance had continued. What remains in the end is a life that was genuinely and specifically itself, not a representative story, not a symbol of something larger. A particular woman from a particular city who entered a particular world as a very small child and gave it her absolute best for more than 2 decades, who danced in a way that people who saw it did not forget, who left when leaving was the right thing to do, even though no one expected it, who fought quietly and persistently to have her own experience represented honestly, who built a small and private life alongside the larger public one, and found that the small life sustained her in ways the large one could not, who held until the end, a love for the art she had practiced that was entirely uncomplicated. Whatever her complicated feelings about the institution, the art itself she loved simply. That love, carried for a lifetime, without requiring an audience, is perhaps the most enduring thing about her. She had been formed, from the age of 3, by beauty, by the belief that certain things, a movement, a sound, a moment of complete attention in a small room, were worth the absolute devotion of a human life. She had lived according to that belief, and in doing so, she had made something that could not quite be named but could, by those present to witness it, be felt. A quality of excellence so complete that it becomes, in the end, something closer to grace. Thank you for spending this evening with the life of Mineko Iwasaki. If you're still with us, we hope the night is gentle, and if sleep found you somewhere along the way, we hope it found you well. Good night.